Murder, specifically the intentional killing of civilians or prisoners of war, POWs, constitutes a grave war crime under international law. The classification of such acts as war crimes depends on the specific jurisdiction, but universally, the deliberate targeting of non-combatants is prohibited by numerous legal frameworks. These frameworks include the Geneva Conventions, which set the international standards for humanitarian treatment during conflicts. Punishments for such crimes can range from long-term imprisonment to the death penalty, depending on the severity of the act and the judicial body responsible for prosecution. International tribunals, such as the International Criminal Court, ICC, and ad hoc war crime tribunals, like those for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, have the authority to prosecute individuals accused of such crimes. These tribunals play a critical role in ensuring that those responsible for atrocities, including high-ranking military officials and heads of state, are held accountable. Torture, which involves the infliction of severe physical or psychological suffering on civilians or POWs, is another universally recognized war crime. The Geneva Conventions and the Convention Against Torture strictly prohibit the use of torture in any circumstances, including during wartime. Acts of torture are typically classified as crimes against humanity when committed on a large scale. Perpetrators may face criminal prosecution, long-term imprisonment, and in some cases life sentences, depending on the jurisdiction. Both national courts and international bodies, such as the ICC, have the authority to try cases of torture, and prosecutions may target both the individuals directly involved and those who ordered or oversaw the actions. Sexual violence in conflict zones, including crimes like sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, rape, and other forms of sexual assault, is explicitly recognized as a war crime under international law. The Rome Statute of the ICC categorizes these acts as serious violations of the laws and customs of war. These crimes often target women and girls but can also affect men and boys. Penalties for those found guilty of sexual violence during armed conflict can include long-term imprisonment, hefty fines, or both, with the severity of the punishment often determined by the scale and brutality of the crime. In recent years, there has been increased global attention on prosecuting sexual violence as a war crime, with notable cases involving the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Balkans. The ICC and other international bodies have placed particular emphasis on ending impunity for perpetrators of sexual violence in conflict. Attacks on civilians, including the intentional targeting of non-combatant individuals and civilian objects, such as homes, schools, hospitals, and cultural sites, are strictly prohibited under international humanitarian law. The principle of distinction, enshrined in the Geneva Conventions and customary international law, mandates that all parties in conflict must distinguish between combatants and civilians. Failure to do so constitutes a war crime. Punishments for deliberate attacks on civilians can be severe, ranging from imprisonment to fines or other penalties. The ICC has prosecuted numerous cases involving attacks on civilians, often focusing on leaders who ordered such attacks. The use of chemical weapons in conflict is prohibited under the Chemical Weapons Convention, CWC, a multilateral treaty that outlaws the production, stockpile, and use of chemical weapons. The use of such weapons is also considered a violation of customary international law. The employment of chemical weapons, whether against civilians or combatants, is classified as a war crime. Perpetrators may face prosecution by national courts, international tribunals, or the ICC, with punishments including imprisonment and fines. High-profile cases, such as the use of chemical weapons in the Syrian civil war, have led to widespread international condemnation and efforts to hold accountable those responsible. Forced displacement of civilians, whether through intimidation, violence, or other coercive means, is considered a war crime under the Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statute of the ICC. This crime involves forcibly removing individuals from their homes or places of residence, often leading to mass displacement and refugee crises. Such actions are particularly egregious when they result in the destruction of entire communities. Punishments for forced displacement can include imprisonment, fines, or both, depending on the scale of the crime. International bodies often monitor cases of forced displacement closely, especially in conflict zones like Syria, Ukraine, and Myanmar, where displacement has been widespread. Pillage, or the looting and plundering of civilian property, is another war crime recognized under international law. Both the Hague Conventions and customary international law prohibit the pillaging of property during armed conflict. Acts of pillage may include the theft of homes, businesses, cultural artifacts, and other civilian belongings. Punishments for pillaging typically include imprisonment, fines, or both, with higher penalties for those who orchestrate large-scale looting campaigns. International organizations, such as the United Nations and the ICC, have condemned the pillaging of cultural heritage in conflicts, particularly in cases like the destruction and theft of artifacts in Iraq and Syria. Denying individuals the right to a fair trial, particularly those accused of war crimes, is itself a violation of international law. The right to a fair trial is guaranteed under international human rights law, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICPR. Individuals accused of war crimes have the right to a regular and impartial judicial process. Depriving them of this right or conducting sham trials is a war crime that may result in imprisonment or fines. International bodies, including the ICC, closely monitor the judicial proceedings in war crime trials to ensure compliance with fair trial standards. Forcing prisoners of war, POWs, to serve in the military forces of a hostile power is a war crime under the Third Geneva Convention. This convention explicitly protects the rights of POWs, including the prohibition of forced labor in support of a hostile military force. Penalties for violating this protection can include imprisonment, fines, or both. The Geneva Convention sets strict standards for the treatment of POWs, and violations can be prosecuted by international tribunals or national courts. Biological warfare, involving the use of biological agents or toxins as weapons, is a violation of international law, specifically the Biological Weapons Convention, BWA. The use of such agents is considered a war crime, with severe penalties for those involved. This includes imprisonment, fines, or both. Biological warfare is widely condemned by the international community, and efforts to prevent the proliferation of biological weapons are ongoing. Indiscriminate attacks, which are not directed at a specific military target or involve the use of weapons that cannot be aimed at a precise objective, are also considered violations of international law. The principle of proportionality under international humanitarian law prohibits such attacks, as they pose a significant risk to civilians. Perpetrators of indiscriminate attacks may face prosecution and penalties, including imprisonment and fines. Recruiting or using child soldiers, defined as individuals under the age of 15, is a war crime under international law. The optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child explicitly prohibits the recruitment and use of children in armed conflict. Punishments for recruiting child soldiers include imprisonment, fines, or both. International organizations, including the United Nations, actively work to prevent the use of child soldiers in conflicts, with notable efforts in regions like Central Africa and the Middle East.